Alright, so let's keep going with this. So we left off sort of here, where we did the sides and the back, and we did a couple of braces, and we've got quite a bit left to do still. So let's try and go a little faster this time. So we've got the bridge, we've got the saddle, the neck, and the fingerboard, and then the pickguard as well. So let's start with the pickguard. So the other thing I did sort of off camera, which is, you know, not difficult, that I mentioned in an earlier video, is just I adjusted the alpha on the image texture here a little bit, just so that we can sort of see through it, and I just dragged it so that it's in front of our model here. And so I've got the alpha set at like 0.5, and under viewport display I just changed the blend mode to alpha blend, and that'll just make it a little bit transparent for us. And I also just dragged it so that it's in front of the model, and now I'm going to lock it so that we can get started working on the actual pickguard. And I'm just going to go back into material preview mode for a second just to have a look here. So normally the pickguard sort of wraps around the sound hole, but it sort of is like, and actually let me just hide this body. You can see it sort of goes around the rosette here. So we're gonna do something like that as well. And so I'm just gonna grab this. I'm gonna, with the guitar itself selected, not the reference image, I'm gonna highlight the rosette by going into face mode, and then I'm just gonna alt click to select this ring, which is the rosette. And actually, let's do it in edge mode so we can just select the outer ring of that rosette, and then I'm going to hit Shift D, which will duplicate those verts, and Escape, which will just leave it in the same position that it was in, and then P, which is separate and separate selection. So now we have a duplicate of those in a different mesh essentially, and I'm just going to get rid of any modifiers that I have on those. Let's see. Get rid of that subsurf because it will duplicate any modifiers that we had on the body itself as well. All right, and so now we have this ring of verts that we can work with. So into vertex mode, and I'm just gonna change the positioning of this a little bit because it seems a little off. Something like that is probably good, and that lines up pretty closely with our body. And then I'm just gonna, with the this circle here selected, I'm gonna select any verts that don't sort of cleanly line up with that pickguard, and just X to delete, and delete verts. And so now we've got verts here sort of outlining that ring around the inside of the pickguard. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select one vert, and if you extrude a single vert, it'll just generate another vert like this. And so I'm going to just extrude one here, and then one across here like this, and just sort of use this to trace out the shape of the pickguard. And one thing you want to make sure that when you're doing this is that you have the same number of verts on the inside here as you do on the outside as you're tracing down. And the reason for that is just because it's going to make it a lot easier to make this a quad-based mesh as we do that. Because this is a flat surface, it would be fine if you left that as an n-gon, because it's a planar surface. It wouldn't cause any weird shading issues, but it might cause problems if we try to edit it later, or if we add a subsurf modifier. So it's just easier if we just keep this all in quads. So I'm just going to extrude and extrude, and I'm just tracing out the rough shape of this, and sort of keeping an eye on the verts on the left hand side here to make sure that I have the same number. And one more, and then I might need to extrude some more from the left here, so I'll do like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and maybe one more here and one more here, and then I'll highlight these last two and F to join. And then if I click the next two up and F to join, I can actually select all four of these and just make it a face. And then if I go into edge select mode and I just click this one edge here, and if I just hit F, 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 all the way up, it will fill in that whole shape. And now we have a simple pickguard. So let's hide our reference image and bring back our guitar body here and just see where it is. Now it does look a little bit, well, first of all, there is some Z-fighting because it's perfectly overlaid on top of the soundboard. So let's just G-Y to drag it just a hair forward. And then I'm also going to extrude it by going into edit mode, A to select all. Oh, screencast keys is off again. Lovely. Is that working? There we go. A to select all and E to extrude. And we'll just make it about yay thick. And it is a little bit blocky, so I am going to add a subsurf modifier to this, which will just give it that nice sort of rounded shape that is sort of typical of a pickguard. And just maybe GZ and just bring it in a little closer. Doesn't have to be perfect, but just so it looks a little more appropriate. There we go, we've got our pickguard. Now, one thing that this pickguard doesn't have is, oh, and actually, just very quickly, notice we're getting some banding on this, and that's because we are subdividing it and it is not shaded smooth. So just click it, right click, shade smooth, and then it will look a lot smoother. There we go. And it is sort of smoothing that over quite a bit, and notice it's looking pretty thin. If you wanted to, you could just even go into edit mode and just add a loop cut here and a loop cut here, just on the outside, just to sort of sharpen that up a little bit. But it will also make those edges a little bit less rounded over. Yeah, something like that is fine. Now, it doesn't have a material, and we're going to make a material because I couldn't find a good texture for pickguards. And just very quickly, so that you know what I'm talking about, I'm just going to do a quick search here. And so pickguards, historically, some of them, guitar picks, were made out of tortoise shell. Nowadays, it's synthetic because they don't want to use an animal product, understandably, and so this is a more ethical product, which is made of plastic, and it's called tortoloid, and it's got these sort of funky brown and yellow colors to it. And it's really sort of an interesting material, but because it's not super common, it's probably not something that you're going to find on, a textures website. I don't think we'll find it in Quixel Megascans. I couldn't find any on textures.com, and so we're just going to make one procedurally. So with the object selected, because we made it from a duplicate of the soundboard, right? We duplicated some verts around the sound hole just to get the same shape. It will have all of these materials, so just click the minus button here with the pickguard selected to get rid of all of those extra material slots, because we only need one material slot for this. And then I'm going to hit new, and I'm going to call it tortoloid. All right, and so let's go into the shading window here and make our tortoloid material. If you look at, if you just Google tortoloid or tortoise shell and look for some examples, you'll notice that it's pretty clearly just essentially, a fancy Musgrave texture with some swirling in it. So this should be pretty easy to make procedurally. So I'm going to hit Shift A in this new material here, and I'm going to search for texture, Musgrave texture. And then I'm also going to add a noise texture. So Shift A, texture, noise. And then I'm just going to mix these together with a mix RGB node. And I'm going to plug this height from the Musgrave texture into the factor, and then also into the color 2. And then I'm going to plug the noise texture color slot into color 1 of this. And so for the values for these, for the Musgrave, I'm going to use a scale of 4.9, detail of 5, and I'm also going to change it from FBM to ridged multifractal. And then the offset shouldn't make too much of a difference, but I'm going to set it at 0.03. And then for the noise texture, it's going to be, leave this set at 3D. I'm going to change the scale to 12, the detail to 5.5, the roughness I turned up to 0.6, and then the distortion is important because that's what's going to give us that sort of distorted look like you would see in real tortoise shell. I'm going to set it to 0.8. All right, And then let's drag this over because we have a few more nodes that we need to do. What we want to do is we want to mix these together. And so I'm going to grab a couple of things. First, I'm going to grab a color ramp. And I'm also going to grab a RGB to black and white. We'll plug this into the black and white conversion, and then that's going to convert this 3-color RGB value into a float, which we're going to then plug into the color ramp. And then we're going to just drag the black channel up on this color ramp a little bit. And you notice we don't have anything plugged in, so I know that you can't see any change on the material yet, but you will when we get to the end here. And then this is essentially what is driving the mix between the colors that we're going to use for the tortoloid. And I looked at a few examples here. I pulled up just a couple of these, and I noticed there's a pretty wide variation in colors. I will give you the exact hex keys that I use for my colors, but there's a pretty wide range, so you don't have to follow this exactly if you don't want. So I'm just going to add another mix RGB node, and we're going to take this color here and plug it into color 1 of this mix node. Sorry, we're going to take that and plug it into the factor of this mix node. And the hex codes that I went with were, let's see, 2F0, F11 for the sort of 2F0, F11, yeah, for sort of the darker brown. And it's got like a little bit of a red tinge to it. It's not completely brown. And then the yellow color will be FBA 958. And I obtain those colors just by using a color picker to sample them from an image of tortoloid that I thought looked pretty okay. And actually, you know what? I just very quickly, just as I'm realizing this, I'm just going to delete this RGB to black and white node because I don't think it's really going to matter that much that we're plugging a color value into the factor slot for this color ramp. Alright, so now I'm going to duplicate this mix node, and I'm going to plug this color slot into the top, into color 1, and the factor for this mix node is going to be our noise texture. And the noise is just going to sort of break up the pattern a little bit. It just makes it a little bit less consistent because, you know, tortoiseshell being a natural material has a decent amount of variation to it. And the color that I used for this was just a slightly darker, slightly more brown color than the main brown. So it's 1F100A that I have plugged in here. And that's just going to make that a little bit darker. And then I will plug this into a bright contrast node because I found that it was not quite contrasty enough. So the brightness I set to 0.130, the contrast I set to 0.300, and actually I have the node wrangler enabled, so if I control shift click, you can see what we're looking at currently. So it sort of is looking, you know, a little bit like that tortoloid that we're after, but it's not quite there yet. So let's go back and continue doing a little bit more work on this. So out of the bright contrast node, I also grabbed a hue saturation node and plugged that into the color slot. And I went with the hue I left alone, but the value I set to 2 because I found it was just a little bit too dark. It looked sort of okay in Eevee, but we're going to be rendering this in cycles. So, and just as a note, when you're doing procedural materials like this, it is a good idea to look at it in the render engine that you're going to be using for your final render because it can look different. All right, now we need another color ramp. Grab another color ramp, and we're going to take the color that's coming out of our mix here and use that to drive this color ramp. And I'm just going to swap the black and white pins. Oops. Just swap these here and just drag it down so it's about 65% black. And then I'm going to plug that finally into not an add node, a mix RGB node. And I'm going to plug the color output from this into color 1. And then the factor for this is actually going to be something that we'll take care of here in a second. So you can just leave that factor empty. And what this is doing is this is going to actually be used for transparency, because the toroidal is, if you've ever seen it in person, it's a little bit weird because it's transparent, but it's not uniformly transparent. So the transparency is greater on areas that are sort of lighter colored. So like sections where it's a little bit yellow will be more transparent than sections that are dark. And so that's what this is. That's what this portion of this shader graph here is going to do. And we're going to create a value that will essentially allow us to turn that transparency on or off, depending, on whether we want it or not. Because you might use this for other things, and sometimes you might want it, and sometimes you might want to tone that transparency down a little bit. All right, there we go. And so I just grabbed this color output and plugged it into the base color, and you can see we've got something that looks pretty okay. It looks very Toroid-like, and let's actually look at this in rendered view. You can see that's looking very much like an actual guitar pickguard. That's sort of pretty accurate to how Toroid looks, but this color ramp here on the left is what you can use to control the mix of dark to yellow, essentially. So if I drag this here, it'll get a little more yellow. If I drag this here, it'll get a little bit darker. And just gonna go for something sort of like that, I think is pretty okay. And this offset value will also affect this a little bit. So I think 0.3 was pretty okay. And one thing I forgot quickly actually is that this mix RGB node needs to be set to an add rather than a mix. And now you can see if we look through it here that it is transparent, but it's not uniformly transparent. It's a little bit of a mix of different transparencies at different parts of the mesh, and that's because we're using this swirl pattern essentially to drive the alpha for this image. And you can fine tune that by dragging this this slider here on this color ramp up and down, and that will give you a bit of a more restricted effect. So I'm just going to tone it down a little bit here by dragging the black slider a little bit to the right. And then the reason that I have this add node here is so that we can adjust how much transparency we have by adjusting this factor. So if we slide it up, it's completely solid. If we slide it down, then it is transparent. So we'll leave it by default at this value of 0. And now let's turn this into a node group, because this is a bunch of stuff, and we might want to use this material for something later. So highlight all of these, right click and hit Control G to group. You'll notice that this brings us into a new window, and to get in and out of this window you can hit Tab in this editor. So if I select this node group, so this is the group that has all of our stuff in it, and hit Tab, it will bring us back here. And you'll notice that anything we had plugged into the principled BSDF is now automatically routed to this group output here. So if you select this bottom portion here and hit N, it'll bring up some options, and we're going to go down to group. And essentially we're just collapsing all of those nodes that we just added here. We're just collapsing all of this into a single node, and that's what that node group is. And so we're just going to name these inputs and outputs so that they are a little bit more easy to handle, essentially. So on the outputs, the top one here is our color. That's fine. The bottom one is our alpha. So let's double click to rename that to alpha. So that's going to be the alpha output here. And then on our inputs, we do actually want a couple of inputs, right? So the first thing that we want is say you wanted to scale this texture. Say it was too large or too small, or you wanted to rotate it. You would need a mapping vector in order to do that. So here on this input section here at the top, I'm just going to click the little plus, and I'm going to change this type from float to vector. And then I'm just going to call this mapping vector. That way we could map this using a texture coordinate node and a mapping node if we wanted to, the same way we would with any other texture. And then the other one I'm going to add, I'm just going to click this little plus here and double click and rename this to reduce reduce alpha is a little more concise, and I'm going to change its type to a float and leave its default value at 0. And now that reduce alpha is what's going to get plugged into all the way over here, the factor of this add node. And so that's essentially doing the same thing as when I was, turning the value up and down in order to reduce the transparency. Now it'll be exposed as a parameter on that node, and we can adjust it there. And then the mapping vector, if you imagine if we wanted to manipulate the size and rotation of this texture, this material, normally what we would do is we would add, for example, by using the node wrangler to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, we would plug the mapping node into this one and this one. So instead of doing that, I'm going to plug this vector input into this one, and that will just act as an input for this node group. So there we go. That's our node group created. We can slide this reduce alpha up in order to make it less transparent, or we can leave it here at 0 if we want it to be sort of semi-transparent. And then if you wanted to change the scale of this, you could just Control T to add, if you have the node wrangler enabled, to add a mapping node and plug that vector in here. And now we can use this to scale it. So if I change this type to texture and plug the generated into the vector, because this is not UV unwrapped yet, we might do that in a little bit. And then we'll change the scale to, let's say, 0.5. We want it to be half as large. We could do that. But I'm going to leave these at 1 because I think that the size looks pretty okay. The other thing I will do is turn up the clear coat. You could also reduce the roughness to make this sort of shiny like that. I think that's okay. Let's have a look actually and see if I turn up clear coat. Does that look? Actually, let's put clear coat at 1 and roughness at 0.1. All right, and let's unhide our guitar body. So there we go. That is our guitar, and now we got our pickguard. So let's go back into layout mode, and there's one other thing that I want to do while we're talking about materials. So when we made these braces, we just duplicated the soundboard material, but in reality, the soundboard is finished, but these braces are not. These braces would be unfinished. They would just be bare wood, so they'd be really rough and not smooth. And if we look at it right now, if I go to rendered view, these are going to be, and you can see the same thing with the inside of the back of the guitar. They're going to be very, very highly reflective, which is not what we want. So to fix that, what I'm going to do is, with one of these braces selected, I'm going to click the plus to make a new material slot, and I'm going to call it, what are we going to call it? Let's call it braces. And then I can click this soundboard material and hit copy. And then I can select the braces material and hit the little triangle here on the right and hit paste. And that's going to essentially duplicate the material properties over onto the second material. And now if I delete that soundboard material, that will make this the primary material for this object. So this brace here now only has that duplicated material on it. And let's do the same for the other brace just by clicking on it and then switching the material to the brace material that we just created. So now if we go into shading for this object, I'm just going to set the clear coat to 0 and the roughness to 1. And now you can see if we look at this, that this is at least the braces. We haven't done the back yet, but we'll come back to that at a later point, are looking a lot more real. And it's because the soundboard is reflective, but the braces are not, which is correct, which is how it should be. All right, let's get started on doing the bridge, which we should probably do next, because that's the next piece here. So I'm just going to bring back our reference image here, and there are a couple of parts to the bridge. So we've got the bridge itself, which is this sort of wooden piece here, and then there are the pins. There are 6 pins that are usually made of ebony or some other dark wood. And then we also have the saddle, which is this sort of lighter portion here, and that's usually made of like hard plastic or bone. Historically, it would be bone. So we're gonna start with just the bridge itself, and then we'll work on the other pieces. So to get started on this, I'm gonna add a let's add a plane and hit RX90, and I can see that the screencast keys has stopped working again. Let's re-engage this and see if we can. There we go. So we'll scale this down and GX to just drag it into position, and then I'm just going to start by grabbing these verts and sort of, you know, positioning them pretty roughly where I think that they should be. And actually, if you look at it, you can see there's sort of a point where like there's a portion at the edges that is kind of scooped out. I'm going to just drag this over in the x-axis, so just G and X, to about where that scoop ends, and then position this accordingly. And then I'm going to extrude in X over to the center line. And then let's add a mirror modifier so that we're only working on half of this. Now you'll notice here right away that our mirror modifier is not mirroring this correctly, and it's because the origin point is not in the center. So if I hit this little button here up here where it says options and click origins, if I do any manipulations to this object now with this enabled, it's going to manipulate the origin rather than the object itself. So with this selected, I'm going to hit G and X, and you can see it's just dragging the origin over, and I'll just put it roughly here in the center, and then go up here to this options tab and turn that off. And so in our mirror modifier, I'm going to turn on clipping and tab to go into edit mode, and then GX, and just drag these central verts over to the right until they sort of merge with that middle piece. Perfect. So now this is one object, and it's got the mirror working correctly, so that anything we do on the left half will be mirrored over on the right. Now this sort of scooped out portion here is also sort of flared inwards, so let's do that. So the way I'm going to do that is in edit mode, with tab, Control R to add a loop cut here in the center, and I'm going to scroll up until we've got a handful. We need enough to make that geometry there. And then I'm just going to select one vert here, and I'm going to hit O to turn on proportional editing, and then GZ and just drag it up. And then I'm just going to scale this up until the proportional editing is affecting all of these verts here. And actually, I'll just grab, yeah, do that. Something like this. And these last couple ones, I kind of want it to come to a point where those last few just sort of are all in a line. So I'm just going to grab those last 3 and hit S. Oops, turn off proportional editing, SZ0. And what that does is it scales all of the highlighted verts to the same position in the Z-axis. So if you ever have like a bunch of verts like this, and say you wanted to put them all in a straight line, you could just highlight them all and hit S, the axis that you want to straighten them in, which in this case is Z, so SZ0, and it'll straighten them all. So I'm just going to do that with these last couple ones here, SZ0, and position them sort of like that, and then just bring this back down to where it should have been, and that's looking pretty okay. Now the bottom part, now the bottom portion of the bridge is also a little bit domed. It's not completely straight across, so let's add that as well. So I'm going to add a few loop cuts here, not quite as many. And then I'm just going to grab this central one and hit GZ, oops, O to turn on proportional editing, and then GZ, and then just scroll up until that's dragging just the verts that I want. And this can be a pretty subtle effect, just sort of like that. There we go. And if these top edges become distorted like this, you know, you can either hide them with H to, you know, before the transform, and then they won't be affected by it, and then unhide them with Alt H, or like we just saw in the previous example, is just highlight all of the ones here and hit SZ0 to straighten them, and that will just straighten those right back up. Perfect. All right, so now let's hide this reference image for a second, and we're just going to go into edit mode, A to select all, and E to extrude. And just extrude it out about that much. That's looking pretty good. And I'm also going to right click and shade smooth. And now before we can finish up this bridge, it also has that sort of scooped portion on the end, right? Starting around right about here. So let's do that. So I'm going to go into top view with 7, and then I'm actually going to hit Alt Z to go into X-ray mode and hide all these verts here on the back side so that we can just worry about the ones here at the top. And then I'm going to select one here roughly in the middle like that with Alt click, so I'm selecting the whole edge, and then O to turn on proportional editing, and then G, Y to drag it in the Y-axis. And I'm just going to scroll down. Oh, sorry. What I actually meant to do was select these here at this end. There we go. And then with proportional editing on, still set to sphere mode, I'm just going to hit GY to drag it back, and you can see it's creating that sort of scoop out here, and then I'm just going to scroll it up until it looks like the scoop is ending in the right position. And now you'll notice here that we run into an issue, right? Because this object, you would think, would just drag all of these verts back the same amount, but when you look at it, right, this bottom line isn't flat, and so the proportional editing isn't affecting all of these verts here equally, and so we're getting sort of a stretching effect here where these verts are not being moved the same amount by the proportional edit. And so to fix that, I'm just going to highlight them, and I'm going to hit SY0. Oops, got to turn off proportional editing. SY0, SY0. I'm just highlighting these pairs of verts that are distorted. SY0, and just do this all the way along, and now it is straightened up correctly. Alright, perfect. So now I'll hit Alt H to bring back those verts that were hidden, and then in top down mode with 7, I'm just going to select the ones at the back here and GY to drag them out a little bit further, something like that. And then in the materials section, I'm also going to apply the sides material to this, just because that is, you know, roughly the material that should be applied to the guitar bridge. And it is all stretched. It's because it's not UV unwrapped. We'll fix that. We'll fix that at a later point. Now I'm also going to come in here in modifiers, and I'm going to apply the mirror modifier, and then I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier, and then we're going to add some loop cuts to sort of hold the shape of this object. So in edit mode with tab, Control R to add a loop cut, and we'll put one here at the top. Control R, do the same here at the bottom, and then we can also do the same here at these ends to make these ends nice and square. And also this sort of scooped out portion here at the top depends on the instrument. Sometimes it is rounded over, but I prefer the look you know, where it's a little bit sharper. So I'm just going to add a loop cut here and a loop cut here, and that's just going to give that sort of a sharper profile on that edge. And I'll do the exact same thing here on the right side as well. So just Control R to add loop cuts and drag them in. And I'm also going to round this bottom off a little bit more. So I feel like it could be a little more rounded than it is. Not by a lot, but just a hair. There we go. And let's bring it into position. So it should rest just on top of the instrument. So GY to just drag it forward here. And if you need to double check the positioning or the scale, you can always just bring back your reference image. I think I'll scale this one down just a hair. And I'm going to apply rotation and scale and smart UV project just to get some material on this. Now, the other thing that's happening here, right, is the same thing that was happening with the braces, where this is a part of the instrument that shouldn't have any finish applied to it, so this shouldn't be as glossy as this, even though it should be made out of the same material as the back and sides, right? And so we're going to do the same thing that we did with the braces, and we're going to duplicate this. So with the bridge selected, and with the sides material selected here in the material properties panel, we're going to go here on the right under the little triangle and hit copy, add a new material slot, select new, and we'll call it bridge. And then under the little triangle here on the right, we will paste material and then delete the sides material from this object. And so now we've got a duplicate material using the same texture maps on this bridge, and we can go ahead and edit this. So let's go to the shading menu and just turn the clear coat all the way down to 0. And the roughness, I'm going to leave the roughness at, what's it at currently? It's currently got the roughness map plugged into it, and that looks pretty okay. It's generally, this wouldn't be completely rough. It would be sort of buffed, so it would be a little bit smooth, and that's probably okay. So we're getting there, but this bridge needs some pins, so let's add those. All right, now for the pins, and actually just before I do that quickly, I'm just going to rename this to bridge and put it in the guitar collection here. And let's rename this to Pickguard, just so that this is a little more clean and tidy, so we know what all of these layers are. And then let's hide that for a second and bring back our reference image. All right, so these pins are generally pretty small, and they are usually made of a very dark hardwood like ebony. And if you just do a quick Google search, you'll see that they have this sort of rounded head at the top and then a little sort of tubular portion at the bottom. For our model, it doesn't matter that we have the portion that goes downwards, because you're never gonna see it. It's gonna be covered up by essentially the head of that pin, and we'll never see the holes. So we don't have to make them, but we do have to make the pin head essentially. And I'm just going to make it out of a sphere. And a quick tip here, actually, in one of my other videos, I talked about the different ways to make sphere topology, because sometimes if you make, let's see, if I hit Shift A, Mesh, and UV sphere, you'll notice that the UV sphere comes with a pole at the top here, and that can sometimes cause some shading issues. In this case, this is actually the type of sphere that we want. So I'm going to hit Shift A, Mesh, UV sphere, and the segments, I think, are a little high just because this is such a small object. You're never really going to see that that detail. I'm just going to turn it down to like 24 and 12, maybe 24 and 16, something like that. And then I'm going to right click it and hit Shade Smooth. And then I'm just going to scale it way down. So scale it down, and GY to bring it forwards in the Y-axis a little bit. And I'm just going to position it roughly over where you can sort of see them here, and you can see whereabouts those should be on this object here. Now for the material, I'm going to make a new material, and I'm going to call it pins, and they're just going to be black because these would typically be made of ebony. And the roughness, I'm going to turn the roughness to, where's our roughness value? 0.5. I'm going to turn it down to like 0.39. You don't want it to be completely shiny, but you do want it to be a little bit shiny. And then I'm going to rotate this sphere 90 degrees. So RX 90, so that we've got the circular topology pointing this way. because if I grab, let me grab a reference image of these pins real quick. Here we go. You can see like this one here, for example, they've usually got like a dot in the center. And so we're just going to do that by assigning a second material to this here. So plus to add a new material slot, new to add a new material, and I'm just going to call it pin dot. I'm going to leave it white, and I'm going to turn the roughness all the way down. And then I'm just going to alt-click to select, oops, these couple of inside portions here, and then shift-click to select this, and then hit assign to assign that material to that. There we go. And then GY to just position that roughly where it should be. And then let's call this pins and drag that into our guitar folder here. So I'm going to hide the reference image and bring back the guitar overall so we can see how we're doing. And just GY to position that roughly. And one other thing is that these pins usually also have sort of a collar around the bottom, and we can add that actually. If we go into side view mode here, we can just grab in X-ray mode a couple of these, oops, turn off proportional editing, a couple of these here like this. We can just drag the pin out a little bit and then add a couple of loop cuts here, put one maybe here, and then one maybe here, and one there. And then with that one selected, I'm just going to hit S to scale and just reposition these a little bit. There we go, something like that, and then GY to just drag that down. Now normally we have 6 pins on a guitar, 12 on a 12 string. So in order to add the rest of these pins, I'm just going to go into the modifiers properties and add an array modifier. And then I'm going to bring back our reference image so that I can get the spacing right. And turn the count up to 6 because there are 6 pins. And then I'm just going to shift click and drag on this factor X here to drag these out until the width looks roughly correct. And we can tweak that later if we have to. But for now, that's looking pretty all right. There we go. So here's the body of our guitar. Now, before we move on to the neck, there is another thing that I wanna do here, which is typically they have it depends on the instrument, but there's often also a pin on the bottom for holding the strap. So we're gonna make that quickly before we move on to the neck. And this is an example of what I'm talking about here. This one is on the neck, but it's essentially the same thing. There's just sort of a little metal pin here stuck in the bottom. We're just going to Shift A, mesh, cylinder to add a cylinder. Turn the verts down to like 24 and right click to shade smooth. And then I'm going to scale it way down. GZ to drag it in this axis and scale. And I don't know, does our reference image have one? It does not, because it's cut off there, so we can't see. But that's okay. We can guesstimate the scale for this for now, and look it up later. So I'm just positioning it roughly here at the bottom and in the center. It's looking all right. Maybe a little bit larger. And I'm gonna make a material for this. I'm gonna call that strap pin. And we're just going to turn the roughness all the way down and the metallic all the way up, just like that. And actually the roughness, maybe leave the roughness at like 0.1 so it's not completely smooth. And see how this looks. And that looks pretty okay. So let's make the profile of this. So to do this, we're going to go into edit mode with tab. And let me just bring up a reference image so that it's always a good idea to work from references so that you know what you're making. So they seem to be sort of flared out at the top and then smaller at the bottom. So Control R here, let's scale it in like so, and then Control R, and also scale it in here. And then we'll grab this and just scale it up a little bit. And let's see if this looks alright. I'm just going to grab this face here. So into face mode and select this bottom face. And E to extrude a little bit. And maybe add a loop cut here and scale it up a little bit just to give it a little rounded profile there on the end. And then on this bottom face, I'm just going to hit I to inset and scale it down a little bit, and then extrude and scale so that it's got this sort of inner portion here. And I think this looks a little small here in the middle. So I'm just gonna scale these up a little bit like that, and then the whole thing, just scale it down instead and bring it up like this. Let's call this strap pin and drag it into the guitar folder. Now the neck is going to be a fairly big thing to work on as well, and that'll be a separate video for sure. So let's sort of finish touching up the rest of the body here, and that'll sort of wrap up this video. So for the rest of the body, there are a couple other finishing touches that I want to add here, which are just gonna make this look a little bit better. If you look here, I've got some reference images, and again, it's always a great idea to work from reference images. Guitars generally have not just a single layer of binding around the outside, but layers of black and white, which are called purfling. So we're gonna add some of those layers just to make this a little more interesting looking. So into edit mode with tab, and let's go back to material preview mode, and I'm just gonna add a couple of loop cuts here around the outside, just one or two here like that. And actually I'm going to hide my subsurf modifier for a second just so that I can get this right. There we go. And now we're going to make another material which will be a duplicate of the binding, but it'll be white instead of black. So same as before. We'll click this little triangle drop down here, copy material, plus to add a new slot, new material, and we're going to call it binding white, and then we're going to paste material and then just change the color from black to white. And then in face select mode, I'm going to select one edge loop here and assign it, and then another edge loop here and assign it. And so now we've got a more interesting transition here where we have layers of black and white leading into that binding instead of just the binding directly. And we'll do the same thing here for the rosette. So the rosette normally would be, a little more interesting than just a black circle. So we'll add some layers here, just add a bunch of loop cuts, and I'm just going to alternate black and white on the inside here, and these are going to look a little displaced because of that subsurf. So let's turn that off for a second and just go through and assign white to every alternate layer, and then an extra loop cut on the outside of each layer of this rosette just to hold that geometry in place, so that when we turn the subsurf back on, it should look okay. All right, so let's get started on the fretboard, which I measured to be 44 millimeters at the narrowest point to 60 millimeters at the widest point. So let's start there with a plane. I'm going to hit RX 90 and just scale this down. And I'm just going to hit tab to go into edit mode in vertex mode here at the top. And then I'm going to select these top two verts, and I'm going to hit P to separate by selection. And then these two verts will be a selection here on their own. And then just GZ to drag this plane down and delete those top two. So now we have two edges essentially as separate objects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale them to those dimensions. So N to open this item panel here on the side, and then let's scale these down to the correct dimensions. So SX to scale, and I'm just going to scale the top one down to 44 millimeters. So 0.044 meters. And the bottom one, I said, what did I say? 60 millimeters. So SX, and scale you down to 0.06 meters. So that'll be the size of the fretboard at the narrowest and widest points. So now I can select both of these, Control J to join them, A to select all, and F to make this into a face. And then the length of the fretboard I measured to be 428 millimeters. So S, Z, and then I'm going to scale this up to 0.428 millimeters. And then if we drag this over here, it should be pretty close. Now this is not the same type of guitar as the one that I was measuring from. So I do have to make a decision about whether to go with the measurements from the reference image or the measurements from the plans. And I think in this case, since I'm not too concerned about being exact, I'm just going to scale this up a little bit more so that it's the same length as what's in the reference image here. So I'm going to sort of center this here and then just hit SZ and scale it up so it's a little bit longer, and just approximately the correct width there. There we go. And so that will become our fretboard. So I'm going to GY to just position this in front here, and actually Shift S to center this. I'm going to Shift S and then selection to cursor, keep offset, and then GZ to drag it back up, and GY to drag it out in the Y-axis, just so that it is in the exact correct position here. And I'm also going to reposition and rescale this pickguard just a hair, so that it's not interfering with this fretboard position, because that should extend down around there. And let's go ahead and extrude this. And the fretboard thickness is going to be, let's go with about 7 millimeters here. So tab, A to select all, extrude it a little bit, and then tab back into object mode. And we're just going to scale this until it's about 6 to 7 millimeters. So let's scale this in the Y only until it reads, or sorry, in the, let's apply our rotation and scale. And then SY to scale in Y until it's about 6.5 millimeters. So let's go 0.065. There we go. Now, if you're not an instrument person, this is something you may not know, but the fretboard on most instruments is not actually flat. It's radiused. So we're gonna do that radius. So I'm gonna hit / just to isolate this, so we can just worry about this for now, and tab, and then 7 to enter top view mode, and Control R to add some loop cuts. And I'm just gonna add, let's see, I'm just going to add 7 or 8 loop cuts down the center of this, right like so. Alt Z to enter X-ray mode, and then I'm just going to select the verts on the underside, and H to hide, and that'll just make this a little bit easier. And then I'll go into sphere mode, and O to turn on our what is this, proportional editing, and then Alt click to select one of these edges here in the center. You want to pick the one that's right in the center, and then GY to just drag that out a bit, and just not too much. You don't want it to be anything too crazy. This is probably a little too much, but something subtle like this is pretty close. And then just rescale it with SY to bring it back down to you know, maybe let's go with 6 3/4 millimeters, and that should be good. And then on this, just because it is going to be really sort of sharp if we don't subdivide this at all, I'm going to add a subsurf modifier and some loop cuts to hold the geometry in place. So I'm going to tab to bring this back into edit mode, Alt-H to unhide those edges that we had hidden before, and then I'll just start adding some loop cuts here to hold this geometry here. So I'll bring one down here like this. Oops, bring one. Turn off our proportional editing. Just GG to edge slide that, and then Control R to bring one here, and we'll do one on this side, and then the same here at the top, like this. And then right click and shade smooth. And then we'll also do the same here on these sides, like so. There we go. And that's just a nice, clean, smooth fretboard, and it's got some nice looking beveled edges here. And now let's give this a material. So I'm gonna click down here, and I'm gonna give it the same material as the bridge. And immediately, it's not gonna look right. And that's simply because we don't have any, we haven't UV unwrapped this. So let's go ahead and do that. If you want to do it quickly, you can tab and A to select all, and then U and Smart UV project. And with any sort of rectangular shapes, that tends to do a pretty okay job. And if you notice here, we're getting some sort of weird shading artifacts here on the bottom. That's because of the subsurf modifier that we're applying here. And if I turn that off, you'll see it gets a little bit better. But I want it there, and so what I can do is just add another loop cut to sort of clean up this edge. And it's just because we're shading smooth. If I were to, my camera battery just died, but if I were to shade flat, you'll see that shading issue sort of disappears. And so I can just bring another loop cut down here near the bottom, and it's just sort of helping to average out those shading normals. There we go. And let's do the same here at the top. Just bring this up a little bit closer to the edge, so this is nice. So I'm going to go charge my camera battery, and then we'll be back.